Really appreciate you having me here today to present and share with all of you. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you again for the second year in a row to share insights on the demand landscape for transportation talent. My name is Erin Olson. I am the Director of Strategic Research for Real Time Talent. Real Time Talent is a public private collaborative that's focused on aligning Minnesota's workforce. So we do analysis in the transportation space as well as pretty much any other sector you can imagine. So if you have ties to healthcare or IT or finance or have talent needs in those areas, chances are pretty good. We have a pretty recent report in those areas as well. So I encourage you to take a look at our website as well for any other workforce questions that you might have. But today I'll be covering some of the recent trends in employment, wages, skill demand, and forecasted needs in 6 transportation pathways. And they're up here on your screen: automotive technology, aviation, collision repair, diesel equipment and truck, marine and power sports, and the truck driving pathway. On the next slide, you'll see just an example of everything that's in that report that Cassidy mentioned is on the Transportation Center of Excellence's website. These accompanying reports include about 10 pages of data and insights on each of the career pathways. You'll find even more information on what industries employ transportation talent in each of those pathways, talent demographics, specifics on skills, knowledge areas, tools, technology, certifications that are in high demand for positions across each of these pathways. And so I encourage you to dig in, take a look at that after today's presentation. There's so much there to unpack. So moving forward a slide, when we look at the transportation and warehousing industry, that's kind of one of the NAICS codes, one of the classifications the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses to describe the transportation industry. This is one of the top 5 industries of highest job growth over the past 5 years in Minnesota. We saw an average of 0.8% average annual growth over the past 5 years. Some of the other high growth industries are management, construction, finance and insurance, and healthcare. Transportation and warehousing employs about 4% of our total employed workforce in Minnesota as of the second quarter of last year. It's about just over 117,000 people. And that dropped just a little bit from what we saw back in 2020. It's down about 0.1 percentage point in terms of the overall share of employment in our state. However, as you'll see in the slides that follow, a large portion of individuals working in transportation or in a transportation function area are employed in industries outside of what we might consider the formal transportation industry. In fact, construction, manufacturing, and even healthcare and retail trade rely heavily on talent in these career pathways as well. On the next slide, we have kind of a picture of overall employment in Minnesota, and then kind of across the bottom of this chart, and then some summary data on each of the 6 pathways that we'll be talking about today. Across Minnesota, we saw a decline of employment of about 92,000 workers, or a drop of about 3.1% employment between the second quarter of 2020 and 2021. And our 5-year forecast, when we're looking out into the future, dropped from an anticipated 49,000 worker expansion from what we saw last year down to about a 31,000 worker growth or expansion over the next 5 years. And that's about 0.2% average annual growth that we anticipate through each year through 2026. If we and I like to use a baseline forecast that's somewhat pessimistic, that says, we in our forecast for these numbers here, we're considering that things sort of continue as we've seen in recent months. Things really don't recover significantly. They also don't get significantly worse. And so we'll be using that baseline forecast for a lot of the things that we'll talk about, from talent shortages to skill gaps and that sort of thing. But if we were to take a more optimistic forecast, saying things dramatically improve from here forward, we see a reduction in, say, labor force exits due to the pandemic, or economic conditions improving, or other lessening impacts of the pandemic on key industry forecasts. We could see up to 1.2% average annual growth over the next 5 years in Minnesota, which would be an addition of about 300,000 more workers in our workforce by 2026. So there's a lot of possibility there, and a lot of it depends on kind of what the future holds, and none of us have a crystal ball. So we know that the reality will be likely somewhere in between that baseline that we see here on this slide, and somewhere around maybe 1.2% average annual growth. In both cases, we're constrained by having a very tight labor market. In whatever scenario we see in the future, we are likely to feel talent shortages across every industry. And that means that employers in Minnesota are likely to have unmet talent needs in some areas due to that tight available labor market, unless we see some new talent relocating to Minnesota and a reversing of those pandemic trends that we've seen, such as labor force exits. So as you can see here, each of the 6 transportation career pathways high level statistics on current employment and 5-year baseline forecasts. The truck driving pathway has the highest forecasted baseline growth at 0.3% average annual growth, higher than that statewide overall average forecast. By wage, aviation offers by far the highest average annual wages, while diesel equipment and truck is the pathway that is most uniquely concentrated in Minnesota compared to what we see on a national scale. And that's also the pathway with the lowest unemployment rate right now as well. Employment volumes in automotive technology and marine and power sports are both higher today in Minnesota than they were 5 years ago, though that growth is forecast to decline in the years ahead due to that tight talent availability. So now let's dig into automotive technology in a little more context. So professionals in automotive technology work in diverse roles, from automotive service technicians to farm equipment mechanics, serving industries as broad as navigational manufacturing and automobile dealerships. In all, about 21,600 people work in automotive technology roles in Minnesota as of the second quarter of last year, which was down about 1.6% from just 1 year prior. So we did see continued decline in that employment over the period of from 2020 to 2021. And during the forecasted next 5 years, employment is anticipated to drop moderately in Minnesota by about 0.3% on average annually, which is about 324 total jobs. So we're talking a relatively small number, but a decline nonetheless. And that's primarily due to a tight talent pool. However, if we see conditions reversing and reduced exits from the labor force, that optimistic forecast puts us at about 0.4% average potential growth in these occupations. Total baseline demand for automotive technology talent is anticipated to be around 9,000 professionals needed to fill positions due to job exits, transfers such as retirements or other job changes. The pathway forecast has actually soured a little bit since our estimates in late 2020. We saw it just kind of drop by a couple partial percentage points. So not a significant drop, but it has gotten slightly worse from what we forecast about a year ago, and that's due to what we've seen playing out over the course of the past year. On the next slide, of all occupations found in the automotive technology pathway, the specific occupations of mechanical engineers and mechanical engineering technicians in particular are uniquely concentrated in Minnesota to a greater degree than what we see in the nation overall. On average, automotive technology careers pay around $61,300 per year. That's higher than what we saw last year. It's up by about $1,200 in terms of annual wage from what we measured back in 2020. So pretty significant. It's also about $2,600 higher than the average wage statewide across all occupations. So relatively high wage on average when we're doing a comparison of averages. Automotive technology talent is primarily concentrated in the automotive repair and maintenance industry. About 24% of all employment of auto tech talent is in that repair and maintenance industry area. And that concentration in that industry increased from what we saw back in 2020. The greater share of talent is really in that industry by about 1.5 percentage points. So pretty notable increase there. Automotive dealers as well, but other manufacturing and agriculture sub-industries also really heavily rely on this talent. about 90% of people employed in automotive technology in Minnesota work for private employers, while about 6% are self-employed, which was a slight decrease from 2020, suggesting that perhaps it was more challenging during the pandemic to be self-employed as an auto tech than employed with a private employer. And then the remaining 4% work for state, federal, or local government entities. On the next slide, I give you just a little bit of a picture of the immediate demand picture for automotive techs, and then what we see as the baseline occupation gaps for where talent shortages may be greatest. By 2026, it is likely that Minnesota will see a growing shortage of mechanical engineers and mechanical engineering technologists and technicians, which is shown in red on the right side of your screen. The estimated annual shortage of mechanical engineers and techs, and as well as electrical and electronics equipment installers and repairs, has worsened since our estimates in 2020. So we've actually seen that talent shortage likelihood increasing and becoming more likely as we've seen seen talent supply consistently not meeting the demand over the past year. Looking out over the next 10 years, 3 occupations in this pathway are anticipated to experience talent shortages. They're shown here on your screen for 5 years. In the report, we also put side by side what it looks like in 10 years in that baseline scenario. So we actually see each of these shortages growing over time. And that's based on modeling, looking at the statewide talent supply, where we're seeing graduates coming through and what that trend looks like over time compared to the demand, age of workforce, likelihood of retirement, replacement needs, that sort of thing. So we're looking at opportunities for mechanical engineering tech, and electronics repairs for transportation equipment really being some critical roles for the future. So on the left-hand side is a snapshot of overall online job postings for occupations for jobs in automotive technology. So all occupations across automotive technology roles over the past 2 years. So since January 2020 through December 2021. So a really nice picture of really the story of what has happened since the pandemic hit, really is what you see here. And after that initial significant drop back in March and April, we've seen a dramatic uptick, and especially last fall, just very, very high demand among Minnesota employers for automotive technology talent. This was one of the industries or one of the pathways where we saw the greatest, most current recent increase in demand. So right now, this is certainly a career pathway to really be focusing on and watching. Moving forward to aviation, in which we're talking about roles like pilots, air traffic controllers, aircraft maintenance technicians, as well as designing, servicing, or piloting drones. That was an addition actually in this report compared to what was delivered last year. We did include drone technician roles in this description, and we were able to do that with an update of some of the occupation codes that is now in effect. So in all, just under 9,000 people work in the aviation roles described here as of the second quarter of last year. That's down about 8% from what we saw a year prior. So much greater decline in overall employment between 2020 and 2021 than what we had seen in automotive technology. Overall, across these key takeaways to the side here, we had about 2.5% unemployment in these roles in 2020. That increased to 3.9% as of the second quarter of 2021. So still not high unemployment, certainly, but it is higher than what we had seen in 2020 or prior to the pandemic. Wages are very high. I've already mentioned this is the highest wage pathway of the 6 we're looking at today. $122,300 per year is what we're measuring as across all aviation roles as the average under most recent estimates, which are based on the fourth quarter of 2020. So dramatic increase from what we had measured a year prior at $94,000 per year. Forecasted baseline average growth is relatively low. It's conservative given the impacts we've seen to the aviation industry over the course of the pandemic as well. And we're looking at about 44% of positions that hold a worker today, that where someone is employed today, will need to be filled by new talent within the next 5 years due to job transitions or retirements. And that's a pretty consistent number across most of the pathways. We're looking at around 45 to 60% of talent replacement needs, which means that high growth or not, there's going to be a huge need for new talent over the next 5 years. On the next slide, we break down and kind of highlight what we're talking about in terms of the occupations that fall under aviation. You can see those listed on the left-hand side with total employment of those roles, average wages by those occupations, with airline pilots, co-pilots, and flight engineers really topping out the wage picture. That occupation in particular is also highly concentrated in Minnesota. It's about 61% more concentrated in Minnesota than what we see on average nationwide. So unique feature to our state. We have significantly low unemployment among engineers tied to aviation as well. So something to really watch, that we have a very tight talent pool there. Top industries of employment include scheduled air transportation, support activities for air transportation. A lot of that remained, this was one of the pathways where we saw the greatest shifts in where employment fell by industry. We actually saw for scheduled air transportation industry, while it's still ranking number one, it dropped from about 50% of all employment in aviation down to 35%. So it lost about 15 percentage points in 1 year of analysis. So really showing how significant that hit was for that industry during the pandemic. On the next slide, taking a quick look at the more immediate demand scenario of job postings and occupation gaps. We are seeing a growing shortage of talent in 5 critical aviation occupations, which again are shown in red on the right. Aircraft mechanics and service technicians, both of those shortages have worsened since our estimates in 2020, while the other shortages that are listed here have improved slightly, but are still very much present. And looking out over the next 10 years, we see all of the occupations within the aviation pathway, except for perhaps aircraft structure assemblers, anticipating significant talent shortages. So all being much greater, except in terms of shortage, except for perhaps that role. On the left-hand side, you can see just how volatile the demand picture has been for this sector. If I could show you the line further to the left on this chart for 2018 and 2019, that line would be significantly higher than where it's kind of balancing out at about 60 postings on average per month across Minnesota for this talent. That's quite low historically for what we've seen for aviation. So we're seeing much lower job posting activity among employers for aviation talent. Perhaps, I'm assuming or presuming a lot into this, but with uncertainty around the future of the aviation industry could very well play into how employers are marketing or choosing not to market open positions at this time. The third pathway that we will take a look at is collision repair. This covers roles from auto body repairers and glass installers to auto body painting, and serving industries as diverse as navigational manufacturing to automobile dealerships. And in all, we're looking at just under 7,000 people working in collision repair roles in Minnesota as of the second quarter of 2021. And this remained relatively flat from a year prior. We really didn't see much change at all. I think it was a decline of about 16 people, so negligible. Collision repair employment is anticipated to continue to remain stable across Minnesota. When we look out the next 5 years, it's looking like 0% average annual growth, just relatively flat, steady demand, replacement demand for retirements and job changes are put us around 3,500 people that will need to have around to fill positions. That's about 51% of positions held today. We'll need to have new talent replacing those career exits. Forecasting future needs, of course, under current conditions is always tricky, as I've said. So, when we compare where we're at today, kind of in the middle of that chart, to where we were 3 years ago or 2 years ago, we will have to see to some extent where the talent supply and demand picture shakes out over the next few years. But the fact that we've seen such consistent kind of demand over the past year, we're looking at forecasts being relatively low and growth likely to be moderate or slow. Of the 3 occupations that are found in this sector shown on the next slide, coating, painting, and spraying machine setters, operators, and tenders are uniquely concentrated in Minnesota to a higher degree than what we see nationwide. They have a high location quotient, we would say. On average, across collision repair careers, wages are about $46,900 per year. And you can see that does vary somewhat between the different occupations in this space, but they're relatively consistent across the 3 roles that fall under this pathway. There's not a lot of variation. And that had increased just slightly, just by about $700 from last year. So we didn't see as great of wage growth between our estimates last year compared to the analysis this year. And it does fall a bit below, about $12,000 below the average wage statewide across all positions. And we see most collision repair talent primarily concentrated in the automotive repair and maintenance industry. About 46% of talent is employed in that industry. And that's been increasing in the share of talent found in that industry in particular. And about 94% of people employed in collision repair careers in Minnesota work for private employers, and about 5% are self-employed. On the next slide, you can see that automotive body and related repairers are forecasting a small to moderate shortage when we're looking out the next 5 years. That shortage does grow significantly when we look out the next 10 years. And all 3 occupations in this pathway, when we look at the 10-year model, are facing shortages. So you would see 3 red bars if we were looking at the 10-year data here. On the left-hand side, taking a look at those job posting volumes, we saw total volume of postings increase by 79% between 2020 and 2021. So it's hard to kind of see it on that line there because it goes up and down quite a bit, but we did see significant demand from employers for this talent increasing significant, while prior, the 2019 numbers had seen a dip of about 25% in total demand. On the next slide, we'll dig a little bit into the diesel equipment and truck career pathway. This includes truck mechanics, diesel specialists, crane operators, and farm equipment mechanics. In all, just under 13,000 people work in this pathway. And when we're looking out into the next 3 to 5 years, as you can see on this chart here, looking at demand continuing to be relatively stable, not significant growth, not really even a decline forecast. We're looking at pretty close to 0% when we look at the forecasted growth potential. In an optimistic forecast, that could be as high as about 0.9% average annual growth if we were able to see a different talents scenario with folks returning to the labor force. Total baseline demand for talent due to job exits and transfers is around 6,300 people needed. So that's just under half of all positions, again, needing to have new talent to replace exits due to retirements and other job changes. All right, and on the next slide, we have again the occupations that fall under this career pathway. We have heavy vehicle mobile equipment service technicians and mechanics, such as farm equipment mechanics and rail car repairers. These are uniquely concentrated in Minnesota to a higher degree than what we see nationally. On average, careers in this pathway pay around $56,000 per year, which is up by about $1,400 per year from what we saw when we looked at this a year ago. And that's, of course, higher than what we see as the average wage statewide across all positions. Diesel equipment and truck talent is primarily concentrated in the machinery equipment and merchant wholesale industry, followed by general freight trucking and other specialty trade contractors. 83% of talent is employed by private employers, about 3% are self-employed, and then 14% work for government, whether that's the state, federal, or local, primarily local. And on the next slide, when we look at the demand picture here, this one looks quite a bit different than others that we've seen to date. We actually saw a large decline in job posting activity for talent in the diesel equipment and truck space just prior to the pandemic. So it actually started in kind of January and February, even before things really shifted here locally. But since about July of 2020, August 2020, we've seen some of the normal fluctuation, the patterns of kind of a cyclical nature of recruitment of talent, kind of mirroring what we have seen in prior years in terms of when activity is happening, when employers are recruiting. Overall volume of new job postings in this pathway have decreased between 2020 and 2021. Most occupations in this pathway are forecasting talent shortages in that low growth scenario. Again, I should mention that if we were looking at a more optimistic forecast, of reopening and shifts in our employers' ability to expand business and find talent, we might actually see some of these occupation shortages even greater than what numbers are on this screen. This is kind of like this is a very conservative estimate, you could say. Bus and truck mechanics and diesel engine specialists is the highest occupation of shortage among all in this pathway. And when we look out with the next 10 years, all of these shortages are forecasted to grow, though overall we have smaller occupation gaps than what we had estimated in 2020 due to shifts in what that talent market looks like right now with the pandemic. So the next pathway we'll take a look at is marine and power sports. And so this includes small engine, motorboat, motorcycle mechanics, outdoor power equipment, maintenance, again, serving a variety of industries. And in all, just over 5,000 people work in this pathway in Minnesota as of the second quarter of last year. This is a decrease of about 3.2% from 1 year prior. And during this time frame, over the next 5 years, we anticipate employment, again, to remain relatively stable, rising by just 0.1% on average annually, again, due to a constrained talent pool. In an optimistic forecast, we'd be looking at about 0.5% average annual growth. Total replacement demand needs is somewhere around 3,100 professionals needed to fill job exits and transfers. So that's nearly 60% of positions held today that would need to be replaced with new entering talent. Forecasting, again, tricky business, but when we look at kind of that third bullet point there, this sector of all, or this pathway of all 6 that we looked at was the hardest hit by the pandemic, had the greatest hit to overall employment. and it's also been sort of the most responsive or volatile. We're looking at about 6.8% unemployment right now. So as of the second quarter of last year, we have about 373 people or so unemployed in Minnesota that are trained and skilled in this pathway that are currently not working. And that's in comparison to 1 year prior, there were 47. So big shift there in terms of the unemployment picture for this particular pathway. On the next slide, you'll see the occupations that are included in this pathway, relatively consistent when we're looking at wage. There's some variation as low as 30,000 for automotive and watercraft service attendants, up to electrical and electronics repairers for that commercial and industrial equipment, coming close to $67,000 per year. Top industries of employment are other motor vehicle dealers, gasoline stations, automotive repair and maintenance, to name a few. We actually saw motor vehicle dealers really rising in prominence. It bumped up from, I believe, number 3 a year ago up to number 1 this time around. So there was a bit of a shift in the industries that employ the greatest share of talent in this pathway. Overall, about 94% of people that work in this pathway area are employed by private employers. About 4% work for government entities. And then looking at talent shortage and kind of some of the more dynamic demand as shown in job postings. Here you can see just how volatile and shifting the demand picture is for talent here. So that those unemployment numbers, for example, may look very different from quarter to quarter as well for this particular pathway. That's also really important to note. We saw overall volume of job postings increase by about 57% from what we saw in 2020 compared to 2021. There had been a slight increase of about 10% 2019 moving to 2020. So we just see that immediate demand landscape really shifting a lot from month to month, even, as you can see in this chart. Looking out the next 5 years, we see electrical and electronics repairers having a moderate shortage in that lower growth scenario. And then we also see, looking out the next 10 years, four of the occupations in this pathway anticipate talent shortages. And the shortage for electronics repairers has worsened since what we saw a year prior. And then last but not least of the 6 pathways is truck driving. The truck driving career pathway for Minnesota really looks at heavy truck drivers, tractor drivers, bus drivers, sales truck drivers, tank car drivers, in all about 260 people in Minnesota working in these roles across the state. This is about a 4% decline from what we saw about a year prior. So a loss of about 4,000 or so workers from our numbers in the second quarter of 2020. Truck driving employment is forecast to rise respectively by about 1,300 total jobs, or 0.3% on average annually. But again, in a more optimistic scenario, we could be looking at more like 1.3% average annual growth. Total baseline demand for truck driving talent is estimated to be around 57,000 professionals needed to fill positions due to job exits and transfers. And like what we saw in the prior pathway, that's about 60% of all positions held today that will need new talent. Looking at the occupations that comprise this sector, you can see that a couple of them, like passenger vehicle drivers, is uniquely concentrated here in Minnesota. That is also the occupation in this pathway that has the highest unemployment rate right now, at nearly 15% unemployment as of the second quarter of 2021. This is one that is certainly tied to the pandemic. and these are passenger vehicle drivers, not including transit or intercity drivers. Truck driving talent overall is primarily concentrated in general freight trucking. About 15.7% of all truck driving talent is employed there. However, school and employee bus transportation, couriers, specialized freight trucking also employ significant shares of talent as well. About 83% of people working in these roles work for private employers. About 8% are self-employed, and the remaining 9% work for state, federal, or local government. And finally, here, taking a look at that demand picture, I saw some really interesting dynamics going on over the past 2 years in truck driving. Overall, we saw about a 0.5% decline between 2020 and 2021 in overall volume of postings. So relatively flat in terms of the whole year compared to each other. But you can see there was a huge spike there in November and December of 2020. And a lot of that was due to logistical needs, kind of the seasonality. We always see a boost in posting activity for this sector during those months. And there was a lot of optimism at that point in time when we were thinking about recovery and vaccination. And so there was, we saw this dynamic also play out significantly across other aspects of the engineering and manufacturing side, logistics, roles, sales, retail as well had a trend like this also occur. From 2019 to 2020, we did actually see an increase in job posting volume of about 16%. So after that initial rise, we've seen consistent demand for truck driving talent. Comparing the talent pipelines that we have to the likely demand over the next 5 years, tractor trailer truck drivers and transit and intercity drivers are the two occupations where we're seeing likely shortages even in that lower demand scenario. And over the next 10 years, that remains relatively consistent. We don't see a huge increase in those shortages or big changes between the 5 and 10 year numbers. So next, I'd like to pause. I know that I kind of flew through those slides and there was a lot of data flying around. Hopefully folks were able to kind of capture some of the insights that were most meaningful to each of you. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat at this time, but since we've got
Erin, I do have one.
Oh, you do? Okay, great.
Yes, yeah, I had one sent to me directly. So
Sure.
the question is, oops, oh no, sorry guys, I just messed with our slide. Well, okay, I'm gonna stop sharing for just a moment here. Now I lost my question. Okay, so what contributed the most to a decline in Minnesota openings in truck driving compared to last year's numbers when the industry is communicating an increase in need for drivers across the country?
Yeah, great question. So job postings are a very helpful indicator for measuring kind of the immediate demand of employers at a point in time. So, and the question was specific to truck driving, correct? Is that okay? So for the truck driving pathway, the one we just spoke to, I would say, 0.5% decline in posting volume is very negligible. That's essentially continued demand. The other piece about job postings is a posting does not equal a hire necessarily. It could equal no hire, or it could equal 100 hires. A posting is a posting. It's a signal of demand. And so what a flat line tells me is that those employers that needed talent in 1 year likely still have those talent needs the next year. And we don't have a sense necessarily of the volume of how many people were or were not hired for reflecting that demand of that demand indicator of a job posting. All we know is that those employers were looking for them. So when we see a dramatic increase in posting numbers, that's telling me that a couple of things, like either employers are using well, this is deduplicating postings. So if I say I'm an employer and I posted the same job 10 times on different sites, it would still count as one post. So a dramatic increase in postings would tell me that more employers are having those same hiring challenges. And additional sets of employers are entering the market and posting those roles. So so what that flat line is telling me is that the demand is consistent, it's not going away. Heavy recruitment, the talent need is there. So that, I hope that answers some of the question there, but absolutely, truck driving positions are what they're always near the top of the list in terms of volume of need and volume of openings from a number of indicators. So
Aaron,
yeah.
I think to add to that, I would agree, but to add to that as well, specific to this particular job, to this particular sector and the job of truck driving, when first of all, I would note that it was already before that the demand was excessively high, and so it's not that it's going up or it's going down; it's just continues to be high. And also when we look at the specific ads and the specific postings for CDL and for truck driver, it is often a plural opportunity within a singular ad, in comparison to a lot of the other sectors where we see singular opportunities for singular ads. Meaning, when they say this, they say truck drivers needed. It's more than one, and often it's well over 20, 30, or 40, or even 50, but it's one posting for multiple openings of the same category in the same company. But again, Aaron's talking about the number of postings. So keep in mind, it's just one posting. It may be 20 people that are hiring based off one posting. So that, but that's not that way in the other sectors of employment. It's not a common characteristic. And so it looks at the data a little differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
We have a question from Jonathan in the chat. How was the average annual wage for truck drivers determined? BLS?
Oh, sorry. What was the last part, Cassidy?
I think he's wondering about the
drivers.
Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Yes.
Yes.
So those are based in the quarterly census of employment and wages. So it's a census of employers on employment and wages. So they're reported by industry and by occupation by employers themselves. So it would not include, say, benefits associated with a role, which we know cost of benefits has increased dramatically in many sectors as well. So that's something additional. It also typically doesn't include bonuses or, like a signing bonus, for example. It's wages, essentially. Does that help? Any further questions on wages? I'm happy to dig in further.
That was kind of also my question too. Is it are the wages, especially in the collision field? I'm a little more of an expert in that field only, but are they only based off the base pay? Because there's a lot of them that are base pay plus commission if they're technicians. And is that I'm talking about what does their W-2 actually show? Because it seems like traditionally, even in the mechanic field also, it looks like they look lower on all these charts than from what we're actually hearing out in the field.
Commission and tips. So like anything that would be kind of variable is not included in the quarterly census data.
I think
so I'm not surprised that they look low for you.
Maybe that would be something that you could asterisk and highlight that, because technicians are way higher than 41,000 a year. And it would be good for on our end when we're trying to show this information to our leadership that there's a variable there.
Absolutely. Yeah. may plus or commissions are not included, or potential for bonuses not included. Yeah. Absolutely.
I think too, because those particular bonuses and commissions that are above and beyond the base salary are, and again, where commissions are the base salary, those are reported, but where commissions are above the base salary and or bonuses, specifically on commissions, not bonuses, those aren't reported. Those are reported on annual things like W-2s and W-4s, but they are not reported in the quarterly census data that DBLS and others have, and mostly because it's not in that particular system. So Dan, that is a good question, and it probably should actually be noted that those ones aren't predictable, and that's why they're not in this particular report. And they also should be noted that it is common. So when communicating with your advisory committee or your administration or others, I think it is important to definitely mention that, and the data is localized.
Say, Cassidy and Aaron, I wanted to mention how much I appreciate the differentiation between growth percentages, but then also the number of positions that would need to be refilled, or people kind of exiting or transferring. I think sometimes when I'm out working with various stakeholders and trying to drum up interest and build credibility for the pathways, sometimes that growth percentage can make things appear like they're not really moving. And so to be really clear about the fact that one element, the growth percentage, is the overall number of jobs that exist, but the number of hirings that are happening is significant. And so that whole differentiation between those things and adding that data in, I really appreciate that. And I also appreciate this kind of forecast of 3 or 4 or 5 years, because so often we're talking to people who are looking ahead. They're choosing career pathways, and they're going to have to spend a little time learning, and maybe they're still a couple of years from graduation, for example. So anyway, I just wanted to say that I appreciate the way that the two of you have decided to lay that out and make the kind of nuts and bolts of what the real potential workforce would experience in terms of looking for a job or job availability. So I just wanted to say thanks, and maybe reinforce that to others in the room through my while I said that too. So
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. And I think you're right, absolutely, that I often see those growth forecast numbers really used as a tool, and we forget that there are other measures of demand that are really important as well, like what's the need to fill those labor force exits, whether it's someone moving up in or making a job change or exiting due to retirements. I think it's easy to overlook that, and we just we can't afford to be overlooking that, because that's where the need really is great, especially in this sector.
I think I also asked this last year, is there a differentiation in the data between, because you group together exits and transfers, and when I hear exits, I think retirements, and when I hear transfers, I think, well, I'm still working, but I chose a different pathway. And so where I'm really getting at is, if we find not all that many exits, but tons of transfers, then I start thinking about, is there an issue with retention in a certain field? So maybe that's not a great question, or it's too loaded, but does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. I'd say, especially when maybe not for the pathway level or necessarily, but especially when you look at a specific occupation and you look at specific occupations that have high rates of transfers, it's definitely something to look at. So it can mean a couple of different things depending on what the occupation is that you're looking at. A transfer is essentially defined as someone who has left that kind of occupation family. So the occupations that are like very, very closely related to it even, and they're taking like another career change. So they say we're working as a technician, and then they became a supervisor in another area, or they took a management role, or you know, something totally different. They're in school at the same time and decided, moved into an IT career. So it'd be like a career shift like that. It wouldn't be like a promotion in the same family of careers. So transfers really does indicate that they've sort of left that career path, and that occupation and that occupation family. So in rare cases, you know, there you could have a case of promotion where like the next occupation in line is sort of outside the family of that role, but oftentimes it's pretty closely related to turnover, and can give you a little bit of a picture of, do we have a problem here? Like in healthcare, we see like home health aides, personal care aides, nursing assistants having very, very high transfer numbers. And we know that those are some of the highest turnover roles that exist right now too. So there's a very close relationship there. Any other last questions as we come up? I think we've got about 5 more minutes together. Maybe even some points that that we didn't talk about today or didn't raise, but you would like to see or wish that we had talked about today.
Just one more real quick one here. So looking at one of the truck driving charts, it shows LQ as a column. I'm not familiar with that. What is that?
Sure. LQ stands for location quotient, and it is essentially a ratio that it allows us to compare like the distribution of employment by those occupations in Minnesota compared to what we see on a national scale. So any number in that LQ column that's greater than 1 means that we have a unique concentration of those occupations in Minnesota compared to what we would see in a typical community nationwide. So 1 is like, if we were exactly the same as the industry and occupation mix of our whole United States, like we would see a 1 there. If we're like 1.2, that would mean that we have about 20% more of our workforces is in that occupation than what we would anticipate or than what we see nationally. So location quotient of 2, for example, is we've got double the concentration of that role in our area. So they kind of grow by orders of magnitude. Does that help a little bit? Kind of a fuzzy definition in some senses, but it's a way to benchmark to how unique industries or roles are to our state compared to a national benchmark.